Hello, and welcome to the first of a couple three debriefs, reflections upon Anyone Got a Match by Max Schulman, which I have just spent months actually reading for anybody who's been sticking around for it. And that I hope is at least somebody. I don't know if anybody actually listened or watched all the way through the entire novel. If they did, if you did, I'd love to know that, because I'm going to be talking a bit now, presuming pretty much that somebody actually, followed the story all the way through. So why any time spent on debriefing this? Why are we talking about it? Well, as I mentioned before, this qualifies possibly as my favorite novel. And it's also kind of funny, that word favorite, because I can't say it represents me. I can't say, you know my heart if you read this book. I think it probably qualifies because I find it the most meaningful. Doesn't necessarily agree with everything or anything like that, but it has the most content of almost any book I know, relative to reality. So what do I mean? I don't know if I can summarize it for you. I will say that I can give some perspective on understanding it that I think is really important. First of all, as I said, when I started all this, it was published right about the moment I was born in late, or at least in the fall of 1964. Now, if we count back on our fingers, back in those days, book printing was a vastly more laborious process, much more time consuming. The setup for a book to be published, particularly from an author who, if not thought of as a great man of American letters, was certainly very widely read and a household name, or close to a household name, in terms of showbiz. If people looked to see who had written certain things, they would find his name. So he had been publishing steadily since the end of World War II. So this was, almost 20 years into his writing career. And it's one of his last few books. He kept publishing a couple more up into the early 70s. Well, 1964, so what? Well, what I'm trying to say is that the book itself, in manuscript terms and creative terms of what was actually in it, predated a few things. There is one mention in the book of John F. Kennedy, and with a God rest his soul following it, which indicates that either by the time the book was being published, they figured they better stick something in there, because I'm pretty sure the book was finished before Kennedy was killed. This also means that a few other things were to be noted. The Johnson ramp up, the public ramp up to the American military's participation in Vietnam, would have occurred either simultaneously with the publishing or by a point long past when the book had any opportunity to be changed. Just as one small detail, one of the elements of the book is a certain dismissiveness toward Polly and Ira's twins, who are basically written off as dolts. And it is quite a relief in plot terms that Polly has forged Ira's signature and shipped them off to go be Marines. And there's no way of knowing there's no way for the author to have known, or in the context of writing the book, what that would mean in practical terms to be shipped off to be U.S. Marines in 1964. You can't pin this on the novel. You can't make it part of the novel's text or subtext in any legitimate fashion. But if we were to go all kind of snarky internet on this, you could say something like, well, wave bye-bye to those twins. They came back in 2 boxes if they were lucky. But so the book doesn't know this, if you want to look at it that way. And it's worth thinking about. Schulman clearly was an extremely incisive, observant person regarding the foibles of American culture. There are some he idealized, and others that he perfectly was perfectly capable of just pounding right on the head with a mallet. And one of those foibles that he apparently wasn't sort of attuned to or commenting on had to do with the role of America in places like Vietnam, of which that was only one place. Granted, in popular culture, this was not widely recognized in the first place, but observant people had been commenting on this for some time, and somebody as literary as Shulman was certainly well read on the works of such people as Graham Greene. So I have no doubt that he was exposed, but it didn't seem to quite hit. And in this case, there's a few other things that kind of show this odd Kennedy era kind of mismatch. I don't think a lot of people understand that Kennedy actually ran to the right of the Eisenhower administration rather than to the left of it. Or that he, excuse me, or that his famous debates with Nixon, everyone talks about Nixon's, 5 o'clock shadow, but they seem to forget that Kennedy actually was out hawking Nixon, much to the latter's irritation. Nixon had been sat on as vice president to Eisenhower for his, fervent, rabid ways, and was itching to get into the president's seat so that he could unleash. And then Kennedy goes and scoops him and says, "Oh, but you were so soft on communism." Nixon, no wonder he pouted his way through all of that. Kennedy basically stole his line. So, but the idea that Kennedy was this kind of wonderful, softy liberal, coming in to sort of restore peace and brotherhood and all the rest of it, has nothing to do with anything Kennedy said or did. So anyway, the point being that what does this have to do? Because the book doesn't mention Kennedy except for that very brief moment. Well, it does much more significantly in, yes, a brief but pointed moment when Professor Lyndon Evarts, refers to himself as carrying a picture of Adlai Stevenson in his billfold, and and Jefferson Tatum was like, But the point being that if you are looking at support for Stevenson and then translating it politically into being kind of a pro-Kennedy person, that translation doesn't really work. I can understand whitewashing that in the 70s and beyond. It still surprises me that people right in the thick of that moment would be capable of basically idealizing, the role of the American military and its role around the world, and not see it in front of their eyes when it had actually been espoused by this very person. So anyway, there's this kind of Kennedy gloss over the whole thing that I remember very, very well, despite only just being born at the moment. I remember it very, very well by being the youngest child of a much older family, so that my parents were actually of the same age as Polly and Ira Shapian. So they were just like a hair year or so younger. So Polly and Ira are hitting 40 in 1964, which would put them 2 years older than my dad. And let's see, I'll even go back a little further, actually put them a little younger than my stepdad. So all of my siblings are born in the late 40s and then all through the 50s, including step siblings. So I'm, very much the afterthought here. But culturally, that actually produces a really interesting situation for me. It means that instead of my parents being young adults kind of rattled by the 60s and trying to figure out where they stand with it, we're talking about people who had been through several phases of change and political shifting in their opinions when things like the birth control pill hit and when the American presence in Vietnam is ramped up, bearing in mind as well that on my birth parents' side, The family is military. So anyway, it's a really interesting thing to pick up this book and recognize, oh, so this is kind of where the landscape of culture that my parents and my older siblings are actually living. So this book oriented me very well toward the different language and the origins of confusions and disagreements that were part of my household. So that's why I'm saying the book actually delivers to you a perceived reality that is extremely nuanced and full of contention and deeply critical of various pieces of its landscape, but nevertheless is an excellent example of a construct, basically, of how the world works and who's in it and what their issues are. So that's, I guess, the first thing. I want to talk about, well, obviously, of how the world works and who's in it and what their issues are. So that's, I guess, the first thing. I want to talk about, well, obviously, the book is all about civil rights, all about racism, all about America and ethnic diversity. It's enormously important. I mean, enormously pointed about this. So that's the big one. We've also got the issue of, food additives / processing / industry, and matters of public health. And then we've also got issues, sort of the more subsidiary things like issues of academia and show business and stuff like that. So all of these things are there, but I think just framing it and saying there's this landscape which was so enormous. So it's almost as though the 20th century, prior to that point, was all leading up to create this particular bubble of viewpoints, including their problems. When I say bubble, I don't mean rosy bubble where everybody's, supposed to be happy. I'm talking about a time that people thought of as tremendously fraught, almost disastrous. Ask anybody in 1964, the world was, everything was over, everything was fucked up, everything's gone to the dogs. Of course, 1968 is bearing down on them like a locomotive, but but at that time, this was the perception. And when I say bubble, I mean all the different things that are perceived to be floating there together in place as who we are, where we are, what's going on. And I would venture to say that by as soon as 10 years from then, pretty much all of it was kind of scrubbed out, except as a reference in terms of propagandizing. So looking at it, it's useful to say, what were they right about? What were they wrong about? And when I say right and wrong, I'm talking about Schulman's judgment of them. I hope you'll agree with me that he was an extraordinarily incisive, critic of many things, but that doesn't mean that I'm saying these are his views are those that I would be running around promoting. So, man, what else? What did I miss talking about? I mean, what is infidelity, right, after all? I mean, the book is not going to let you get away with a good guys and bad guys look at infidelity. And then second, it's also deeply concerned, committed to, thoughtful about being Jewish in America, even though the only Jewish character that I think I can genuinely identify in there, unless Clendenin is hiding something, but would actually be Ira's secretary. But the references and the relevance to the characters is quite present and quite sharp. So these are all things that should be looked at as 1963 in America. What is the range of viewpoints about them and their particular interrelations with one another? Because if all of, we can think of all this culture and all these events kind of culminating in this, and then our lives since then have been the shattering of it. So I actually see it as the term inflection point has unfortunately joined a host of other terms I like, in having been, co-opted into some stupid soundbite. But the book is a real nice picture of not just any time in world and American history. So anyway, that's where I'm coming from. I hope you join me on a couple of those to check out some of these different issues, to look at that and say, how did it come to that viewpoint, and what has happened to that viewpoint since? Not to mention to appreciate some of the book's remarkable power in terms of getting into it, just seeing what happens. And I'm certain that anyone who has listened to any of these segments can appreciate Schulman's just tremendous love of language. And he is not alone among the authors who influenced me that way. But even in reading the book, and especially reading it aloud, I can see phrases and things that just baked themselves right into me, and I start to talk like that. So I can look back on this and say, yeah, this is one of those. This is one of those books that helped do that. All right, lots more to talk about. That includes situations including a mongoose that got into our house at one point, and situations that included, hosts of other strange picked up readings from around the parents, and why that book happened to be discovered in that closed off box under the stairs, as opposed to just being up on the shelves for me to pick up. What was I doing back there in those closed off boxes? Lots of things to talk about at that personal level too. So I will be happy to see what you think as we continue through a couple more Friday Lives of thinking back on the book and what it said.